Welcome to UBI Unplugged, breaking down the future of income.
All right, let's see if we can actually break something down today. I'm always skeptical, but willing to listen. What have we got?
Well, there's a lot happening, as always, but a few things caught my eye related to trade, tariffs, and how all this chaos trickles down to, well, everything, including intergenerational equity. Did you guys see the latest on these reciprocal tariffs Trump's rolling out?
Oh, absolutely. The reciprocal part is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, huh? It's based on such a unique calculation.
Unique is one word for it. I saw one report saying it basically boils down to we don't like the trade deficit, so we're going to whack them. Makes me wonder if they even considered the downstream effects.
That's exactly it. The CNN piece highlighted how this calculation divides a country's trade deficit with the US by its exports into the country times 1/2. I mean, come on. That's hardly a sophisticated approach to balancing trade. And the fact that economists cited in support of this are uncomfortable with how their research is being used, that's a huge red flag.
Right. It ignores so many underlying factors. Currency manipulation, different regulatory environments. All things Bianchi at Evercore ISI pointed out. It's like using a butter knife to perform surgery.
Okay, but let's say, hypothetically, that there's some merit to the idea of rebalancing trade. Is using tariffs the right way to do it? I mean, isn't there a better tool in the toolbox?
And it's not just the immediate market jitters. It's the long-term consequences. Retaliatory tariffs, increased costs for consumers, businesses halting shipments, Jaguar Land Rover pausing shipments to the US, Nintendo delaying pre-orders. It's a ripple effect. This stuff hits everyone eventually.
See, that's what I'm talking about. The average person is just trying to make a living, and suddenly their cars are more expensive. Their electronics are pricier, all because of some trade war. What's the solution then? Just let other countries rip us off, as the saying goes.
Nobody is advocating for being ripped off. It's about finding smarter, more sustainable solutions. Diplomacy, trade agreements that actually address the root causes of imbalances, investing in domestic industries to make them more competitive. Not just slapping on tariffs and hoping for the best.
And this is where I think a universal basic income, or UBI, becomes even more relevant. Because when policies like these tariffs disrupt the economy, disproportionately hurting low-income individuals and families, a UBI can act as a safety net, a buffer against that economic volatility. It's not a silver bullet, but it provides a baseline level of security.
Whoa on. UBI, that's a pretty big leap. So you're saying because this policy might screw things up, we should just give everyone free money? Doesn't that create dependency? Doesn't that stifle innovation? Doesn't that incentive non-work?
Those are valid concerns, and we need to address them head on. But think about it this way. Tariffs are essentially a tax on consumers, right? They increase the cost of goods. A UBI could offset some of that increased cost, especially for those who can least afford it.
Exactly. And the pilot programs we've seen, like the one in Stockton, California, showed that people didn't just stop working. They used the money to find better jobs, start businesses, invest in their education. It gave them a chance to breathe, to be more productive, not less.
Okay, Stockton is one city. How do you scale that up to a whole country? The logistics, the funding. It sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
The logistical challenges are real, no question. Identity verification, fraud prevention, these are hurdles we need to clear. And the funding model is crucial. Wealth taxes, carbon taxes, these are options that have been floated, but they each come with their own complexities and potential pitfalls. As the article mentions, there is potential for fraud and issues in benefit calculation.
And that NPR piece about the Senate GOP passing the budget plan, it highlights the fight over how to pay for tax cuts. They're even considering using a procedural gimmick to make the $3.8 trillion it would take to extend the Trump tax cuts appear to cost nothing. That's concerning to say the least. It would shift the tax burden down to future generations.
A gimmick? That sounds like something my uncle would cook up after a few too many beers. How does that even work?
Essentially, they're using what's called a current policy baseline, which assumes that current policies will continue indefinitely. So, extending the tax cuts isn't counted as new spending because it's just continuing what's already happening. It's a way to hide the true cost.
Which is incredibly short-sighted. It prioritizes tax cuts for the wealthy over long-term fiscal stability. And that's where intergenerational equity comes in. We're saddling future generations with debt to pay for tax breaks today. That's not fair.
So how does UBI fix that? If they're already playing fast and loose with the budget to give tax cuts, where's the money for UBI going to come from? Are we just going to print more money and hope for the best?
That's the critical question. The budget piece mentions the Senate plan calls for $4 billion in spending cuts, while the House intends to cut at least $1.5 trillion. Some people are worried those cuts can't happen without a significant hit to Medicaid benefits. Also, these are all proposed cuts, but there needs to be a concrete and sustainable funding plan. Relying on debt or cuts to vital social programs is not the answer.
Absolutely. The funding has to be progressive and sustainable. Wealth taxes, carbon taxes, closing corporate tax loopholes. These are options we need to seriously consider, and we need to reevaluate our spending priorities. Are massive defense budgets really serving our long-term interests, or are we just perpetuating a cycle of conflict and instability?
Okay, wealth taxes, I'm inherently skeptical. How do you even implement that without everyone just moving their money offshore? It sounds good in theory, but practically, it seems like a nightmare.
You're right, the implementation is tricky. International cooperation is essential to prevent tax avoidance, and we need to design the tax in a way that's fair and doesn't stifle investment. But the principle behind it, that those who have benefited the most from the system should contribute more to support society, is sound.
And it's not just about the money. It's about creating a more just and equitable society. A UBI, funded by progressive taxation, could help to reduce wealth inequality, improve social mobility, and give everyone a fair shot at success.
A fair shot. That sounds nice, but what about personal responsibility? What about hard work? Are we just going to reward people for doing nothing?
It's not about rewarding people for doing nothing. It's about providing a foundation, a safety net that allows people to take risks, to pursue their passions, to contribute to society in ways that aren't just about making money. Plus, the Stockton example shows that it can increase workforce participation.
And think about the changing nature of work. Automation, AI. These technologies are going to displace millions of workers in the coming years. A UBI could provide a way to adapt to that changing landscape, to ensure that everyone has a basic standard of living, even if they can't find traditional employment.
So, the robots are coming for our jobs, and the answer is give everyone free money. That sounds like a dystopian sci-fi movie.
It doesn't have to be dystopian. It could be a way to create a more equitable and sustainable future. But it requires careful planning, thoughtful implementation, and a willingness to address the potential challenges head-on. The tariffs are not the solution, no matter how they pitch them.
And it requires a shift in our thinking. We need to move beyond the idea that economic success is a zero-sum game, that someone's gain must be someone else's loss. We need to create a system that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Easier said than done, right? I still have a lot of doubts about UBI. The funding, the implementation, the potential for unintended consequences. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but we can't afford to dismiss it out of hand. We need to explore these ideas, to experiment, to learn from our mistakes. Because the current system isn't working for everyone. The wealth gap is widening, inequality is growing, and future generations are facing a future of economic uncertainty.
And those retaliatory tariffs, as this all triggers, will only make it that much more difficult. The CNN video showed that Britain's second biggest city has a big garbage problem, so it's clear there are other domestic challenges here at home that need attention.
Okay, you've given me something to think about. I'm still not convinced, but I'm willing to keep an open mind, especially with the threat of robots stealing my future profession.
That's all we can ask for. Let's keep digging into the data, analyzing the pilot programs, and exploring different funding models. The future of intergenerational equity depends on it.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, but it's one that we can't afford to ignore. And hopefully, by continuing these conversations, we can move closer to a more just and equitable future for everyone.
Well, I'm off to start hoarding canned goods in anticipation of the tariff apocalypse. Thanks for the chat, folks.
Haha. Good luck with that. See you next time.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Join us next time on UBI Unplugged.
Oh, I almost forgot. What about inheritance laws? How does UBI affect those? Isn't that a huge part of intergenerational wealth transfer?
Good point. We almost glossed over that. Okay, so inheritance laws, they definitely play a huge role in perpetuating wealth inequality across generations. I mean, if you're born into a family with significant assets, you're already starting miles ahead of someone born into poverty.
Absolutely. Inheritance is basically the ultimate head start. And while I'm not advocating for abolishing inheritance altogether, we need to think about how to level the playing field.
So, more taxes? Surprise, surprise.
Potentially, yes. Estate taxes, for example, are one way to redistribute some of that inherited wealth. But the key is to find a balance that doesn't discourage wealth creation or incentivize tax avoidance.
And UBI could actually complement estate taxes. Think about it. If everyone has a basic income, they're less reliant on inherited wealth to survive. It reduces the pressure to accumulate and hoard wealth across generations.
But wouldn't that just discourage people from working hard and saving? If they know their kids are going to get a UBI anyway, why bother leaving them anything?
That's a fair question, and it's something we need to consider. But I think the vast majority of people want to leave something behind for their children, regardless of whether they have a UBI or not. It's about more than just financial security. It's about legacy, about providing opportunities.
Exactly. And a UBI could actually free people up to pursue more meaningful legacies. Instead of focusing solely on accumulating wealth, they could invest in their communities, start businesses, create art, or contribute to society in other ways.
Okay, I see your point. But what about family structures? How does UBI affect those? Does it encourage people to have more kids, knowing they'll get a UBI for each child? Does it undermine the traditional family unit?
Those are complex questions, and there's no easy answer. Some studies have suggested that UBI could lead to a slight increase in birth rates, particularly among low-income families. But it's not a guaranteed outcome.
And even if it does lead to a slight increase in birth rates, is that necessarily a bad thing? Many developed countries are facing declining birth rates, which could have negative consequences for their economies and social security systems.
Okay, but what about the impact on marriage? If people don't need to rely on marriage for economic security, does that undermine the institution?
That's a legitimate concern. But I think the reasons people get married are far more complex than just economic security. Love, companionship, family. These are all important factors.
And a UBI could actually strengthen families by reducing financial stress and instability. It could give parents more time to spend with their children, more resources to invest in their education, and more opportunities to create a stable and loving home environment.
So you're saying UBI could actually be good for families? That's a pretty optimistic view.
It's a potential outcome, yes, but it's not guaranteed. We need to carefully consider the potential impacts on family structures and relationships when designing and implementing a UBI program.
And we need to be open to adjusting the program based on the evidence. If we see that it's having unintended negative consequences on families, we need to be willing to make changes.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential benefits of UBI, but I'm still worried about the cost. Where's all this money going to come from? Are we just going to bankrupt the country?
The cost is definitely a major concern, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer to the funding question. We need to explore a combination of different revenue sources, including wealth taxes, carbon taxes, closing tax loopholes, and potentially even reducing spending in other areas.
And we need to consider the potential economic benefits of UBI. Increased consumer spending, increased entrepreneurship, increased labor force participation. These could all generate more tax revenue and help to offset the cost of the program.
Okay, but even if we can find the money, how do we ensure that the UBI is actually effective? How do we prevent fraud and abuse? How do we make sure the money is going to the people who need it most?
Those are all valid concerns, and they highlight the importance of careful program design and implementation. We need to have robust identity verification systems, strong anti-fraud measures, and effective mechanisms for delivering the UBI to recipients.
And we need to be willing to learn from our mistakes. The pilot programs we've seen so far have provided valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities of UBI. We need to continue to experiment, to evaluate, and to refine our approach based on the evidence.
So you're saying UBI is a work in progress. That's not exactly reassuring.
Of course, it's a work in progress. Any major social policy reform is going to be a work in progress, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The potential benefits of UBI, reducing poverty, increasing economic security, promoting social mobility, are too great to ignore.
And remember, the status quo isn't working. Wealth inequality is at an all-time high, and millions of people are struggling to make ends meet. We need to be willing to consider bold new solutions, even if they're not perfect.
Okay, you've convinced me to keep thinking about it, but I'm still going to be skeptical. Show me the data, show me the results, and then maybe I'll be a true believer.
Deal. Let's keep digging into the evidence and see where it leads us.
Agreed. The conversation continues.
All right, I really need to run this time. Gotta prepare for that robot uprising. Later, folks.
Take care.
Until next time on UBI Unplugged.
Actually, one tiny point before I really go. What about inflation? Doesn't just giving everyone money automatically drive up prices?
The inflation question. It's a big one and a very valid concern. The short answer is it could cause inflation, but it depends on how it's implemented and the overall economic context.
Exactly. If you just inject a whole bunch of new money into the economy without increasing the supply of goods and services, yeah, prices are going to go up. Basic economics.
So, problem solved. UBI causes inflation. Case closed.
Not so fast. There are ways to mitigate the inflationary effects. One is to fund UBI through taxes rather than just printing money. This redistributes existing wealth rather than creating new money.
Another is to ensure that the UBI is set at a level that's sufficient to meet basic needs, but not so high that it creates excessive demand. It's a balancing act.
A balancing act that politicians are supposed to perform. I'm suddenly much less confident.
I hear you, but it's not just about politicians. It's about having independent economic experts and policymakers who can monitor the economy and adjust the UBI program as needed.
And remember, inflation isn't always a bad thing. A little bit of inflation can actually be good for the economy, as it encourages spending and investment. The goal is to keep it under control.
Okay, but what if the UBI does cause significant inflation? What happens to people on fixed incomes like seniors? They're already struggling with rising costs.
That's a crucial point. We need to ensure that seniors and other vulnerable populations are protected from inflation. One way to do this is to index Social Security and other benefits to inflation, so they automatically increase as prices rise.
Another is to provide additional support to low-income individuals and families through targeted programs like food stamps and housing assistance.
So, more government programs? That sounds like more bureaucracy and more waste.
It doesn't have to be. We can streamline existing programs and make them more efficient, and we can use technology to reduce administrative costs.
And remember, the cost of not addressing poverty and inequality is also very high. Crime, healthcare costs, lost productivity. These all have a significant economic impact.
Okay, I get it. There are potential solutions to the inflation problem, but it still seems like a risky proposition.
It is, but all policy decisions involve risks. The key is to weigh the potential risks against the potential benefits and to make informed choices based on the best available evidence.
And to be willing to adapt and adjust as we learn more. The future of intergenerational equity depends on it.
All right, now I really have to go. The robots are calling my name, or maybe it's just the pizza delivery guy. Either way, gotta run. Thanks again.
Enjoy your pizza.
See you next time on UBI Unplugged.
Wait. One last, super quick question. What about people who are, really irresponsible with money? Won't they just blow their UBI on lottery tickets and beer?
That's the age-old moral hazard argument, isn't it? The idea that if you give people money, they'll just waste it on frivolous things. And sure, there will always be some people who make poor choices, regardless of their income level.
But the evidence suggests that most people are actually pretty responsible with their money, even when they're struggling financially. The pilot programs have shown that people use their UBI to pay for basic needs, like food, housing, and healthcare.
Okay, but what about addiction? What if someone has a substance abuse problem? Are we just going to enable their addiction by giving them free money?
That's a very serious concern, and it's something we need to address. One approach is to provide support services to people with addiction problems, such as counseling and treatment programs. This could be linked to the UBI program so people have access to help if they need it.
Another is to structure the UBI in a way that reduces the risk of misuse. For example, we could provide a portion of the UBI in the form of vouchers that can only be used for certain goods and services, like food and housing.
Vouchers? That sounds paternalistic. Like the government is telling people what they can and can't buy.
It's a trade-off. We need to balance the desire to give people autonomy with the need to protect them from harm. And vouchers are just one option. There are other ways to address the issue of addiction, such as providing financial literacy training and encouraging responsible spending habits.
And remember, addiction is a complex problem with complex causes. It's not just about a lack of money. It's about trauma, mental health, social isolation. A UBI can't solve all of those problems, but it can provide a foundation of economic security that makes it easier for people to access the help they need.
Okay, I see what you're saying, but it still seems like there's a risk that some people will misuse the UBI. How do we minimize that risk?
By carefully designing the program, by providing support services, and by constantly monitoring and evaluating the results. There's no perfect solution, but we can strive to create a UBI program that is both effective and responsible.
And by remembering that the goal is to help people, not to punish them, we need to approach this with compassion and understanding, not with judgment and condemnation.
All right, I'm convinced. You've addressed my concerns about irresponsible spending and addiction, but seriously, I really have to go now. The pizza is getting cold and the robots are getting closer.
Enjoy your pizza and good luck with the robots.
Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time on UBI Unplugged.